Friends, colleagues, students, guests, welcome to the keynote lecture for the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning's second annual symposium, Transformations, Action on Equity, which this year is hosted in partnership with Parla. My name is Julie Willis and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning, and I also serve as a Director of Parla. This morning's proceedings began with an extraordinary acknowledgement of country delivered by Sarah Lynn Rees. Given we have a number of additional guests in attendance this evening, I reiterate that we acknowledge the elders and descendants of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation who have been and are the custodians of these lands. We acknowledge that the land on which we meet was a place of age-old ceremonies, of celebration, initiation and renewal, and that the local Aboriginal peoples have had and continue to have a unique role in the life of these lands. It is a particular pleasure to introduce Sharon Egretta Sutton, who will deliver this evening's keynote presentation entitled Activists Transforming Injustice. This is what change looks like. Sharon Egretta Sutton dares built environment professionals to accomplish an equitable future, not for themselves, but for the society that they serve. She will challenge participants to begin their pursuit of gender equity by looking outward at today's devastating social and ecological challenges. This keynote envisions built environment professionals who advance equity by digging deep into the well of feminist know-how. It asks them to facilitate community problem solving around today's ruinous social and ecological challenges and offers them strategies for doing so. It's my great pleasure to welcome Sharon to the lectern.
You know, it's a really long way to get here from New York City, and I encountered about every obstacle and delay that there was. But today made it all worth it. It's been a great program, has it not been? So my job is to put some ribbons and bows on what's already been said and perhaps turn things a little bit on their head. So let's get started with the last act of day one. I became a licensed architect in New York State at the height of the women's movement. It was 1976. Is there anybody here who was born after 1976? Quite a lot of people. So this is going to be sort of a history lesson. It was 1976, and there were fewer than 800 women architects in the entire United States. I was the 12th black woman to become licensed, and I believe the 6th or the 7th a black woman to join the American Institute of Architects. What a heady time it was. All across America, feminists were organizing to provoke transformation of the economic, political, and cultural fabric of society. They protested in the streets and at rallies, hearings, marches, sit-ins, legislative sessions, and even at the Miss America pageant. Feminists were united in sisterhood, operating informally, shunning hierarchy, giving everyone a say in running things, and challenging patriarchal assumptions about the nuclear family, to address the practical problems of second-class citizenship, whether due to race, gender, or class. They conceived of such support systems as in-home daycare, Big Sister programs for pregnant single women, and exchanges of old clothes and books. They demanded birth control, reproductive freedom, equal pay, and non-gendered employment. Sisterhood was power and empowering. In New York City, a hardy band of women architects united in sisterhood, and I was among those avowed feminists. We met at each other's apartments and at the Architectural League of New York to share wine-soaked stories about how sexism we had experienced and to plot revolutionary design strategies. Some of us organized the Women's School of Planning and Architecture, or WISPA, an experimental summer program that set out to critique the gendered construction of space and understand how the designed environment oppressed women. The 7 feminists who founded WISPA wanted to create an affordable learning environment for students to imagine and design what a whole new world where the needs of women and other second-class citizens would be primary. Though it convened only 4 times, WISPA forged a lifelong network of friends, colleagues, and social justice advocates. Others of us joined the Alliance of Women in Architecture and drew up a manifesto calling for the elimination of sex roles and their negative effects for individuals and institutions. Among our demands, we called for the elimination of sex stereotyping in jobs, for a revision of income tax laws that penalize people for their marital status, and for the inclusion of child care facilities in the construction budgets of public buildings. We presented our manifesto to city and state lawmakers, and guess what? Today, most of our revolutionary ideas are commonplace. Still others wrote articles and books, mounted exhibitions, and created safe spaces for women to explore their oppression in and by the designed environment. Groundbreaking among these efforts was an exhibition that opened in March 1977 at New York City's Brooklyn Museum, called Women in American Architecture, a Historic and Contemporary Perspective. The exhibition consisted of 99 easels with panels from a book of the same title that was published by the Whitney Library of Design. This project was spearheaded by the Architectural League through its archive of women in architecture, with Susanna Torre as guest curator and book editor. The project included a piece of my work with children, which Susanna had convinced me fit the definition of architecture. New York Times critic Ada Louise Huxtable vehemently disagreed with Susanna's inclusive view of the field. In a review titled "The Last Profession to be Liberated by Women," she declared Susanna's project, and I quote, "a most unsettling picture of women's limited architectural achievements." Overlooking the groundbreaking efforts of feminist architects to transform sexism in the designed environment, Huxtable instead zeroed in upon their status in the architecture profession. Here's what she wrote. At best, the woman architect has been poorly prepared in technical and scientific fields by high schools and women's colleges. Social attitudes and cultural forces have steered her away from architecture. She has been excluded from the male clubbiness so characteristic of the profession, and once in a firm, is limited in her contacts with clients and site supervision. She has never been admitted to the architect star system. As an architect, she has been expected to take stereotyped roles, work conservatively rather than innovatively, shock no one, and stick preferably to a domestic practice with an architect husband, perhaps branching out into large-scale housing or schools. Maybe it was Huxtable's devastating review that helped shift the focus of women in architecture from injustice in a patriarchal society to their own lack of professional status. Maybe it was simply the times, when a newly affluent middle class adopted a meaner, more selfish outlook that was hostile to the needs of the less fortunate. At any rate, by the 1980s, a greatly expanded group of women architects had zoomed in upon the workplace to see how they could gain influence and notoriety within the profession. They advocated for addressing inequities related to salaries, mentoring, career advancement, sexual harassment, and lack of work-life balance, among other unjust workplace conditions. As evidence of the mainstreaming of the women in architecture movement, activity shifted into that most conservative of organizations, the American Institute of Architects, or AIA. Over half a century, the AIA and its collateral bodies established work groups, tracked the numbers, organized conferences, and sponsored studies. On workplace issues, unquestionably, women architects have made great progress. For example, in 2004, Iraqi-born Zaha Hadid was admitted to the Architect Star system when she became the first woman to receive architecture's highest honor, the Pritzker Architecture Prize, defying Huxtable's claim that women architects shock no one. Hadid was recognized for her experimentation with breathtaking spatial concepts in all fields, from architecture and urban planning to product and furniture design. In 2016, the AIA recognized the husband-wife team of Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown at the behest of none other than Frank Gehry. Writing in support of their nomination for an AIA Gold Medal, Gehry described the team as, and I quote, two great intellects instead of one ego, end of quote. Not only was the duo the first to receive the honor after a bylaws change allowed for the nomination of a pair of architects, but Scott Brown became the first living woman to receive the medal after being passed over for the Pritzker, after being passed over when Venturi received the Pritzker. 3 years earlier, Julia Morgan had been awarded the gold medal 56 years after her death. Norma Sklarek laid claim to many firsts, including being the first African-American woman to become a registered architect in California, the first to join the AIA, and the first to be elevated to fellowship. At Gruen Associates, she defied Huxtable's claim that women were relegated to domestic practice, having positioned herself in production rather than design in order to complete large, complex projects, including the California Mart in Los Angeles, the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, and the Blue Wave at LA's Pacific Design Center. For sure, much has changed since Ada Louise Huxtable penned her critique of Susanna Torre's project, and as Justine and everyone else today has shown, much has stayed the same. For example, just to give a few things, the 2018 AIA Firm Survey revealed that long work hours and sexist perceptions of childcare still result in women's attrition from the field at mid-career. Pay gaps persist between men and women at all levels. 20% of respondents reported that their firms still have all-male leadership. And a post-Me Too backlash is making men more reluctant to hire women in positions that require close interpersonal interactions. Because of the consciousness raising by older generations, today's female and trans architects are more prepared to confront such structural sexism, and they are organizing in ever larger support groups to overcome the barriers they face. However, in our inward-looking attempt to gain status within the mainstream, we may have become blind to its inequities. To reframe Audre Lorde's brilliant observation, we have moved into the master's house and are using his tools, including power hierarchies, economic inequality, and commodification of goods and services. Lorde would caution that we cannot demolish this house of inequity with the same tools that built it. In her words, the master's tools, and I quote, may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. This conference calls for genuine change, for transformations. But what should we try to transform? Should we join forces to transform the gap in pay equity among architects? Or should we hone in upon the gap in housing affordability that has left millions of families worldwide living in substandard housing, paying an inordinate amount of their income for housing, or homeless altogether? Should we use our sense of empowerment to transform the Me Too backlash that denies us opportunities for traveling with men? Or should we zero in upon the increasing level of migration as 1 in 7 of the Earth's population flees native soil due to war, poverty, natural disasters, and a host of other factors? Should we become a force for transforming our absence in firm leadership? Or should we become leaders in battling the long-term increase in the planet's overall temperature, as evidenced by rolling blackouts, food and water shortages, oceans filled with plastic, and diminished biodiversity? Just as occurred half a century ago, women are protesting their marginalization, marching in the streets to transform the ruinous social and spatial challenges in what is now a global society. A half century ago, feminist architects joined their sisters, using their powers of critical inquiry to uncover the role of the designed environment in women's oppression. Today, that role is common knowledge. Most discerning people fully recognize that social and environmental justice are inextricably linked. Let's look at the facts. In America, poverty rates are more than 1/3 higher for women than for men, especially for Black and Native women. Globally, they are highest for children, especially among girls, and the gender gap widens as boys and girls get older. According to a United Nations study, women are poorer, hungrier, and more discriminated against than men. And they are less likely to escape poverty because women have less access to jobs and economic opportunities, are often paid less than men, and can work fewer hours because they shoulder a disproportionate share of household tasks and child care. That is, low-income women of color suffer the same discrimination as women and trans architects, but many do so while enduring extreme poverty. Ethnic minority women's lower economic status translates into an array of environmental injustices. Studies show unequivocally that low-income communities of color across America and worldwide experience more pollution and contamination than other communities. Black and brown women and their children lack access to housing, fresh air and water, green space, healthy food, personal safety, and countless other environmental rights to which every human being is entitled. These women are often excluded from decisions about the use of land, water, and other natural resources, while being disproportionately affected when ill-conceived, polluting projects cause forced displacement or increase the effects of climate change. These environmental injustices call out for a powerful and empowering sisterhood of architects to help them imagine a whole new world in which the needs of women and all marginalized people are primary. Some women are answering this call. Among them, Liz Agbu, founding principal of Studio O in San Francisco and an advocate of socially engaged design. Agbu is a product of Harvard's Graduate School of Design and a nonprofit design studio called IDEO.org. She tackles wicked social problems of healthcare and infrastructure that struggling communities across the globe face. Ever mindful that altruistic projects can actually hurt communities, she spends time getting to know the stories of her constituents before designing such facilities as shelters for U.S. immigrant day laborers, clean cook stoves for the citizens of Tanzania, and portable toilets for low-income residents in Ghana. Tatiana Bilbao stands out as another woman who is seeking to transform spatial injustice. Raised in a family of architects and educated at one of the most prestigious universities in Latin America, she began her career advising Mexico City's Department of Urban Housing and Development, and then founded a studio practice and a collaborative research center. Though she has designed many luxury homes, Bilbao is best known for large-scale social projects, especially a modular housing prototype that she designed after interviewing hundreds of low-income residents in rural Mexico. The prototype, which can be adopted to local materials and built for as little as $7,000 US, has become a case study for architects worldwide. Mabel O. Wilson also stands out as a transformative public scholar, educator, and practitioner. With racial violence dominating the U.S. news, Wilson has responded with a cross-disciplinary look at how architecture shapes cultural identity in America's racialized urban space. An architecture professor at Columbia University and senior fellow at the Institute for Research in African American Studies, she is a founding member of Who Builds Your Architecture, a group of scholars, practitioners, and students that advocates for fair labor practices around the world. Wilson is what Cornel West refers to as an intellectual freedom fighter, operating both within and outside the frameworks of power, which puts her in a strong position to reinvent the master's tools. It would be disingenuous of me to beckon you to create a world where all people's needs are met without revealing my own engagement with this challenge. To provide a developmental perspective, as a young architect, I was young once, I initially worked hands-on to help poor people change their surroundings. But the changes were small, labor-intensive, and sometimes only in the form of a plan or future vision. Then I received a W.K. Kellogg Foundation fellowship that instilled the idea of working upon a larger canvas to change hearts and minds. Instead of the tools of representation and construction that I had learned to use as an architect, I began using the tools of research, writing, and public speaking. Some people said I was no longer an architect, but I disagreed. Let me describe my current project, and you can decide for yourselves. The project is a forthcoming book, written for a general audience, that reflects the perspective I developed during the civil rights movement about the power of Black youth to transform society. As a teenager, I was mesmerized by news reports about these youth risking their lives to advance democracy's promise of liberty and justice for all. So, in the 1970s, when I, as an unemployed intern architect, worked with low-income, primarily Black and Hispanic youth to help them improve their derelict schools and communities, I expected my charges to accomplish miracles. Years later, as principal investigator of a Ford Foundation-funded study of community-based youth programs, my expectations were equally high, but informed by a lifetime of community-engaged scholarship and practice. In my book, I will use data from that Ford Foundation study to change hearts and minds about low-income Black and brown youth, who some people see as needing guidance to avoid the problems in urban ghettos, and many more see as the cause of these problems. I want my readers to come away convinced that these youth are and have been key players in the nation's struggle for justice. I also want them to become advocates for an alternative to the highly effective tradition of youth organizing to demand equal opportunities. Such activism is based upon the notion of continued economic growth and is no longer sustainable, not only because the fruits of growth are ever more inequitably distributed, but also because endless expansion is in itself unsustainable. I argue that youth, in their efforts to address the practical problems that surround them, are forging an alternative to this prevailing model of activism. My book, Youth Activists Transforming Injustice, shows that in a nation and world consumed with unsustainable growth and its corollaries, economic inequality and racial intolerance, Black and brown youth have been working hands-on to ameliorate the injustices that engulf them. The youth featured in my book are proactive rather than oppositional. They emphasize community building rather than individual rights, foster civic rather than political engagement, and assume responsibility for creating change rather than demanding it. Whereas youth historically have set in, marched, and rioted to demand their rights, my book reveals an alternative in which youth are actively improving their circumstances, mapping neighborhood resources, building community capacity, eliminating blight, creating business enterprises, developing cooperative housing, growing healthy food, among other interventions. My book positions youth unapologetically as proactive change agents. It highlights both the fundamental right of youth to participate in their communities and their proven capacity to transform injustice in those communities. And it pinpoints race as a defining feature in young people's lives. However, I push further than traditional scholarship on youth activism. First, in lieu of the oppositional forms of resistance that often involve confrontation, I advocate for the relational approach of sisterhood that involves collaboration and dialogue. Second, I position the material world in which young people experience inequities as the focus of their activism. The youth programs presented in the book serve impoverished communities with enduring histories of racial oppression. They mentor youth for academic success while simultaneously helping them understand the root causes of oppression in the material world. And they view such understanding as a precursor to improving that world through socially critical vehicles of change. To illustrate distinctly different vehicles of change, the book highlights a theater program in Detroit's Corktown neighborhood that deploys artistic expression as it brings together a multi-ethnic, intergenerational group to narrate the city's decline and rebirth. An internship program on an organic farm in Waianae, Hawaii, that deploys cultural preservation as it reconnects Native and mixed-race Hawaiian youth with a cultural tradition of working the land. And a youth development program in New York City's Harlem neighborhood that deploys personal responsibility with Black and Latinx youth through a process of self-reflection, critical analysis, and collective action. I have described the book in detail because I believe its theoretical framework for youth activism applies equally to women and trans. In particular, I propose that these architects can help poor people transform environmental injustices by replacing the master's tools with the tools of liberation, including critical awareness of the root causes of injustice, kinship networks that enable collective action, and placemaking that transforms social and spatial relationships. Let me explain why these tools can help this assembly bring about genuine change in our increasingly inequitable global society. Your first tool, helping poor people become critically aware, is essential because identifying the root causes of an injustice is a first step toward overcoming it. This idea was advanced by renowned Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, who did time both in prison and in exile due to his radical approach to teaching peasants to read and write. Critical awareness was also the cornerstone of the 1970s feminist architects and resulted from those wine-soaked discussions about sexism in the designed environment. The conversation today will be much more difficult, requiring you to help women develop a multi-dimensional understanding of their unequal access to a healthy, safe environment, to protection from environmental harms, to good housing, schools, and employment, and to environmental decision-making, among many other rights. However, the same principle applies of organizing structured conversations until participants are able to make meaning out of multiple aha moments. Your second tool, helping poor people create kinship networks, is also essential, just as it was for African Americans during slavery and Jim Crow. Extended families, blood relations, and non-kin as well were the bedrock of the Black community. They promoted self-reliance and self-help, sustained hope, and provided survival strategies that did not stop at individual doors, but reached into the community to link with churches, schools, nonprofit organizations, and businesses. The communal characteristics of Black culture, also found in other indigenous cultures, were foundational to second-wave feminists. By developing solidarity with other women, they were able to deconstruct the gendered power relationships within the nuclear family and take collective action as members of a larger community of care. The kinship networks this assembly will need to forge will be much trickier, because, as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. noted, we are, and I quote, a family unduly separated in ideas, culture, and interest, who, because we can never again live apart, must learn somehow to live with each other. End of quote. Yet a widespread clannishness has arisen that fans the flames of intolerance and emphasizes differences in lieu of commonalities. Learning to find common ground and live together as one extended family will undoubtedly be this assembly's greatest challenge. Your final tool, helping poor people engage in transformative placemaking, is essential because it allows you to cultivate hope and possibility among disenfranchised groups by engaging them in the participatory act of reimagining their surroundings. I contend that the material world is simultaneously a source of inequality and oppression and a context of transformation and possibility. In the tension that lies in the gap between place as inequality and pace as possibility are bridges to a whole new world, whether transitory or structural. The process itself represents a defiant act of resistance that helps poor people contest their relegation to undesirable locales and proactively change those locales. Though placemaking may merely soften harsh conditions, this assembly can use its processes to help poor people bring about new social and spatial relationships. As the world's population continues to multiply upon a planet with a decreasing land mass, this assembly must envision and help others envision new relationships with each other and with the earth. I challenge you to engage poor people in placemaking that sustains their livelihood without destroying the environment, that replaces the mechanized processes of agribusiness with land-conserving, labor-intensive food production, and that maintains affordability while accommodating the higher densities of an exploding urban population worldwide. Most of all, I challenge you to engage poor people in placemaking that positions housing not as a commodity that produces wealth, but as a human right so that no one has to worry about being evicted or having a home or lands taken away. Mine is no small charge, but is achievable through a sisterhood of architects, designers, urban planners, and all the people who make the designed environment, including the people who use it. I end by asking this assembly to dig deep into the well of feminist know-how to help marginalized communities develop a shared consciousness of the root causes of the injustices they experience, to facilitate kinship networks within those communities that can erase the intolerance that is preventing us from working with each other, and to engage them in envisioning new, sustainable relationships in the world house we all share. I am asking you to reject the master's tools in favor of these tools of liberation. I am asking you to transform the future, not for yourselves, but for the global society you serve. Thank you very much for including me in this symposium and for allowing me to share my ideas on what change looks like. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sharon. A most extraordinary talk. You're a most extraordinary woman. There are undoubtedly questions for the audience, and we have time for a few questions. And the mics will be roving. Yes, in the middle.
I can project if that's okay. Thanks so much for the speech. Interested in your ideas on placemaking and how you mentioned that we need to develop greater kinships with each other and with the earth, and yet the very act of dwelling and avoid, excessive parochialism, although you had a better word that's now skipped my mind. The act of dwelling in place necessarily bounds us or develops some sort of exclusivity from the mere act of dwelling. So how do you see that tension between parochialism or exclusivity that can come from dwelling and attachment to place and the need to develop broader kinships? Is it an inward-outward dialectic we need to think about, or is there something else at play?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, I just got feedback on this book. It's been out for review since July, and that was one of the issues that one of the reviewers raised, and it came up in the 60s. It wasn't you. You weren't the one. But it is something that's on my mind because it was a problem in the 60s where we said, oh, let's do localism and give the power to local people. But then there were local people who were very well-to-do, who had a lot more power, who said, we don't want this in our community. And so it became very exclusionary. So I think it is a dilemma of how you connect to your local place and also collect to this idea of the world house. I think that's the huge challenge. It can't be either or. It has to be both and. If you're not connected to and taking care of your local place, I think that's a disadvantage. But then if you begin to protect that and become exclusionary or parochial, as you say, so that you don't, you're not able to understand. We talked about empathy earlier in the day. So empathy being something where you can understand the experience of something you have never experienced. And I think that has to be a very strong part of this local placemaking, is also being able to understand other environments that you have never experienced. And one of the things that heartens me about some of these youth programs that I've looked at is that a lot of them do involve international networking and sort of connecting to other kinds of environments that are very different from their own. So we'll keep working on it. But it's a good question and a challenge.
As Julie said, you are an extraordinary woman and your presentation was also extraordinary. What I want to know is about you personally. What motivated you to take this journey, this extraordinary journey?
Well, it's been a long journey. I'm coming up to 79. And it's been an extraordinary life. I started out as a professional musician. I was born in the Midwest in a city that was known as the Gateway to the South, kind of right in between where segregation was legal and segregation was a social custom, and which was pretty interesting. I just went to my 60th high school reunion and sort of relived all the racial tensions of my high school days. At any rate, it was a great high school. I got this liberal, it was a public college preparatory school in which I had to take one of the arts, so I took music, and I selected the French horn. It selected me because it was free, and my parents couldn't afford an instrument. But you know something? If you could play the French horn and you didn't miss any notes, you'd get a job. And so even though everybody said, and the unions were segregated at the time in Cincinnati, as was my neighborhood, I ended up working because I didn't miss notes. So I got to New York City. I became a musician. I worked on Broadway. I worked with the ballet companies, with the Bolshoi Ballet, and a lot of great things happened to me as a musician. But in the course of trying to get housing, while it was still kind of segregated, but in New York, you didn't really know whether people weren't renting to you because you were black, because you didn't have enough money, or because you played the French horn. I mean, all of those reasons could have been so I ended up renovating a building. I developed a building. I had to have a place to live. And that's how I got interested in, well, I was always interested in space, because the relationship between sound and music is, I went over yesterday and I had this wonderful tour of the music school. The space makes the sound. So I always knew space was important. But at any rate, I renovated this building, and then came a riot at Columbia University, and they needed, I was taking interior design kind of at night, because during the day, because I only worked at night in the theater. And there was a riot at Columbia University. You can read about this. It's in a book called When Ivory Towers Were Black. That's when Columbia University recruited a lot of Black and Hispanic, Puerto Rican students, actually. And I was one of them. So I got an Ivy League education, free, and I became an architect. So, and then I wanted to, when I was in architecture school, we were having the revolution, and we were talking about architecture was going to change the world, and we were going to design for the people. And then I got out of school, and as I mentioned, I was unemployed for a while, and then I started working at Pratt Institute, and I wanted to teach my students to design for the people, and realized I didn't know anything about how to do that. So I got a PhD in psychology, and that set me off on an academic career. I just have had one opportunity. I've had one obstacle after the other, and one opportunity. Anytime anybody blocked me over here, there were 3 other people who came along and did amazing things. So I believe in serendipity and being open. Are there students in the audience? There's students. Keep your mind open to opportunities. Don't have such a plan that you close yourself off to opportunities. Just keep your ear to the ground, and opportunities come along, right? So that was my journey, a little bit of it. And check out When Ivory Towers Were Black. It tells the whole story, not just of me, but the whole situation.
Thank you so much for your talk and for your inspiration. I really like how you started with the power of sisterhood, and you ended it with it still today. And even if it may be disheartening that we still need to be talking about this today, I like how you are looking into youth and the power that they have. Because at university it's very common to hear that young people are not engaged, but I think that they are proving themselves that that is not true. So I also know that architecture is a profession that it's hard to get into and it's hard to know about, and it's important for us to make sure that young people from all backgrounds know that that is a possibility. And I would like to know more about your relationship with these youth groups when you were working on the book, and what you learned from them, or what you think that they can change.
Right. I've written this book proposal 3 times, trying to find how to frame. I have a huge amount of data. This was a 3-university study that had 23 researchers, junior and senior. So we have a ton of data. How to frame it. One of the first idea that I had, it was called Talent Unveiled. So one idea that I had, rejected because it was too narrow, was, we always talk about the pipeline. There's no pipeline. And I think that's a red herring. There is a pipeline. It's those kids out there working on their neighborhood. You know, you go into the schools to tell people about architecture. Why don't you ask them about it? Ask them about their own experience of living in their homes instead of telling them what architecture is. So that was going to be my first framing, but it didn't fly. So I tried a couple of other things. But I think that, you know, it's not that we make architecture hard to learn about. It's part of that master's house, right? It's part of the unjust system. You know, the young woman who's kind of responsible for me getting here, who's in the UK, a black woman, who tracked me down and eventually convinced me that I should do this interview. She started off asking me about my musical career, and she said, well, so when you got into architecture, it must have been a complete change. I said, well, no, because I've been doing homemaking all along. I mean, we all make our places. And I think that, you know, what we do is to make architecture be this holier-than-thou kind of thing. I've sat around so many faculty tables listening to faculty talk about first-year students who have gotten into prestigious universities who have bachelor's degrees in other fields saying they don't know anything. Come on, they do know something. They know a lot. So I think, you know, we don't have to look to the people we're trying to get in. We have to look to ourselves to change how we're talking about the field and how we're representing it to other people.
One last question.
You're going to have to shout at me.
Sorry, I don't have a loud voice. Kind of adding upon that, so what do you suggest those of us who are already in practice, how can we include, so it comes to regeneration of communities, we tend to develop areas without actually paying attention to who actually lives there, you know, the backgrounds of the people that live there. So how can, it's all good going into schools and encouraging the youth or young students going to university to think about themselves in terms of placemaking, but how can we encourage that within larger practices, especially global ones, where it tends to be all about money and making profit?
Yeah, how do you get around capitalism?
Basically, yeah.
Well, you owe many thousands of dollars for your education. That's a problem. I think that sooner or later, the whole thing is going to fall apart. We have, I guess tomorrow we're going to talk about health and well-being of students. You know, we have students who are homeless, who are not eating, who get out of school and they owe so much money. They can't follow their dreams. And that's really a pity. And I don't have a magic bullet for getting rid of capitalism. You know, I'm encouraged by the people in Hong Kong who are saying, you know, we're not going to take this anymore. You know, sometimes in social work, I hang out a lot with the social work, because all the people who tell me I'm not an architect, they say, oh, she's a social worker. So I go over to the social workers. They tend to think that things being bad are not all terrible, because when things get really bad is when you stop putting Band-Aids on them. And I think what we're doing now is we're putting Band-Aids on problems. So you're kind of stuck in you're part of a system that I think is going to radically change. And I have great hope that this generation has the capacity to turn things upside down, because I think they really need to be turned upside down. At a certain point, we have to say, we're not going to do this anymore. We're not going to allow a very slim percentage of people to have all the money while everybody else is working hard. It's not that we're not working. You know, part of the problem is we're working so hard to stay alive, to make a living. We don't have time to do change, right? I mean, you know, how many hours a week do you work, right? And to support somebody else, this is not right. So at a certain point, we have to say, no more. We ain't gonna do it. And you know, whatever, as long as I'm, you know, as long as I can do it physically, I'm going to be out there when it all falls apart. And I tried it out at the climate change. I've gone on many marches, but the youth climate change, you know about that in Australia? Did you participate in that here? Well, I went down to Wall Street in New York City, and it was the most organic protest I've ever been in. There was no structure whatsoever. It was just a mass of people in very tight streets. And so, and we would be still, and then we'd lurch forward. And I thought, oh, I'm going to get hurt. So I noticed these 4 black women, and they had organized. First of all, I had seen that people were moving in snakes, and I tried to get onto one snake, but I couldn't quite do it. But then I watched this group of 4 women, and there was the tallest one was in front with the biggest sign, and the shortest one was in the back with the smallest sign, and I was shorter than the shortest one. And they were holding on to their backpacks. So I held on to them. And wherever they went, I went. All the way to Battery Park. So whenever you guys say that this is enough, we're not going to do it anymore, I'm going to be there with you.
Thank you so much. I think we could listen to you all night. But unfortunately, we do need to let the teams go home, so we will have to call this evening to a close. Thank you everyone who came specially to hear Sharon tonight, and thank you for all of you who have been here all day.